President, Dr. Dennis Asanis.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dennis Asanis.
And I'm Eleni Asanis. We hope you're all healthy and safe.
We want to welcome you to this very special event organized by the University of Delaware's Biden Institute, featuring one of the most interesting figures on the nation's political stage these days.
And we want to thank everyone at the Biden Institute for making this event possible.
It is noteworthy that we're having this event just 26 days before the elections. And wherever you might fall on the political spectrum, I think it's safe to say that one of the nation's biggest challenges is a lack of trust. Surveys tell us that too many Americans don't trust the government, don't trust the media, don't trust the institutions in our society. This is a critical issue facing our nation. Trust lies at the foundation of our democracy, and both of us, being Greek, know something about democracy. And we can tell you, trust will remain essential to our progress as a society. Our guest today, Pete Buttigieg, or Mayor Pete, as he likes to be called, has given this topic a lot of thought. And he has put those thoughts together into his new book, titled Trust, America's Best Chance. Mayor Pete writes about the importance of trust and faith in our American democratic institutions. He also writes about how critical it is for our country to bridge the partisan divide, face the challenges ahead, and return to a sense of normalcy and kindness to one another. Mayor Pete grew up in South Bend, Indiana, and later served 2 terms as mayor. He is a graduate of Harvard University and an Oxford Rhodes Scholar. He served for 7 years as an officer of the US Navy Reserve, including a deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. Of course, most of us know Mayor Pitt as a presidential candidate earlier this year. In February, you might recall, he won the Iowa caucuses, becoming the first openly gay person to ever win a presidential primary or caucus. I might say also that Eleni and I had an informal conversation with Kathy McLaughlin at the Biden Institute right after that caucus. And we said, apparently, as you've shared with us, you were his teacher at Harvard. And we said, you educated Mayor Pete very well. And she jokingly said, apparently too well. So, I mean, Kathy probably recalls that. And this event today is one of the first stops on Mayor Pete's virtual book tour. So we're very honored to have you, Mayor Pete, with us. And of course, we're equally excited that Mayor Pete will be interviewed by our very own Kathy McLaughlin, his former professor, who serves as UD's executive director of the Biden Institute. It is especially fitting that we're bringing these 2 individuals together for this event. Pete and Kathy have been friends for years, beginning back when Kathy was the executive director of the Institute of Politics at the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. And Pete was a student leader on her student advisory council. You could tell he was a radical even then. So I know they have a lot to talk about, so please join me in welcoming Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Kathy McLaughlin.
Thank you, Dr. Asanis. Thank you. And Peter, welcome. It's so great to have you here. I said, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember the first meeting we had when we were at the Kennedy Library and Senator Kennedy came over to me. It was the Profile and Courage Award event. And Senator Kennedy came over with you and said, you know, Kathy, you have to keep an eye on this guy. He's going places. Little did we know, 20 years later, I'd be sitting here interviewing you as an author, a former mayor, and a presidential candidate. So at first, I just want to say thank you for being here.
Well, thanks. It's so fun to be reunited, and I guess you should get a lot of credit and/or blame for all the things that I learned not that long ago, and it's just such a treat to be back together. And thanks so much to President and Mrs. Asanis as well for the warm welcome. I'm so excited to be together virtually today.
Good. Well, I have to say how proud I am of you, and I have to tell you, Senator Kennedy would have been so proud to see you here. So I just want to share that with you. So Peter was the president of our student advisory committee. You'll see there's about 25 of our students. We have a student advisory, and I gave them a little warning that I'm expecting 20 years from now, I'll be interviewing one of them. So hopefully you'll share your wisdom with us. Our mission at the Institute was engage young people in politics and public service. Obviously, Peter took that mission to heart. Today, I know you're here to talk about your book, and we want to know more about your book called Trust, which, thanks to your publisher, I have had the opportunity to read. So it was a great book, and I'm excited to talk about it. And for everybody listening today, you can go to mayorpetebook.com if you want to order a copy. So a little advertisement as we get started. Before we talk about your book, much like we always did at the IOP, I like to give students an idea of how you got to where you are from when you were a student hanging out in my office, 20 years ago, to running for president. So if you can tell us a little about your story. I think some people know, but it's nice to give some context for students who are thinking about this.
Yeah, so the Institute of Politics, where I was almost magnetically drawn as a student, and where you played such an important leadership role, as you know, really was built around the legacy of President Kennedy, and I think partly out of the fact that he didn't start out very interested in politics. Something happened to him in his formation and in his studies that led him toward a life of public service, and the nation was better for it. And so that living memorial to President Kennedy at the Institute was all about stirring that interest in people. I think it's safe to say I had that interest when I arrived, but growing up, I was in a family that was politically aware but not politically connected. I don't think I ever met an elected official. In fact, the first time I did might have been with you when I had the chance to meet Senator Kennedy and others at an event for that essay contest at the Kennedy Library. But I grew up in a family that really cared about what was happening in the world, always watching the news, always talking about it over dinner. And the magic of being at a university was being able to begin to engage people who were doing it. And what I realized was, on one hand, the people who were leading the world were very impressive, very intelligent, very experienced, very interesting. On the other hand, they were just people. And you began to realize that there was no mystique. They were not on a different plane of existence. They were people who made difficult choices and as best they could sought to serve the public. And I went home with that, I think, awareness, and it changed my sense of empowerment to be among those people. The funny thing for me was that, I grew up also in a city in the middle of the so-called Rust Belt. Our city grew up around the auto industry and suffered a collapse in the 1960s that we were still trying to deal with when I was growing up in the 1990s, and in many ways are still responding to as a community. And I had got the message that success had to do with getting out and going away. And by the time I got to Harvard, when I thought about politics and public service, I was mostly thinking about international affairs and national politics, only to realize gradually over time that there was so much purpose back where I came from, that the best thing I could do was go home and make myself useful there. And it was on that path, especially after getting tired of the head shaking and the hand wringing, people saying after an article, many articles came out, and one in particular proclaiming the death of our city, that a lot of people in my generation who, like me, had left, started thinking about coming back and saying, wait a minute, we're not going to take that. This is our city. We love it. We got to do something about it. And that was a thought process that led to my becoming mayor, something I never would have guessed would be in my future, even when we were talking about political life at the Institute.
Great. So let's talk a little about your book. One of the things you say in the beginning is, when we talk about a more trusting time, that you don't want to be this as an invocation of the past, but rather to think about the future and how we can work together to create it. So do you want to talk a little about that?
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia about how there used to be a more trusting time. And it's true, by the way, if you look at the numbers, the trust that the American people had in our institutions, in our government, in each other was dramatically higher half a century ago than it is today. In fact, the low levels of trust today are the crisis that motivated me to write the book. But the other side of it is that when we talk about a more trusting time, we got to decide, are we only talking about the past? Or could it be that when we talk about a more trusting time, we're describing the future? And if we believe that, then we have to commit ourselves to creating that future. It's a tough thing. It is more difficult to restore trust when it's been lost than it is to create it from scratch. But that is exactly what America's got to do, not just here at home, but also we've got to get nations around the world to trust us in a way that that really has broken down in recent years. And the reason it's so important is that trust is necessary for cooperation. And cooperation is necessary for the biggest issues we face today, from the pandemic, which depends on just individual cooperation on things as simple as wearing a mask or social distancing, or complex patterns of global cooperation that are the only way we can beat the climate crisis before it swamps all of us. And so in issue after issue across all of the crises that face America, from the climate crisis to the moral crisis over racial justice, we've got to find ways to build up that trust. And that's what the book's all about.
Great. I think the story that you told about when you were in Afghanistan and that moment in this incident that you had an accident, or can you tell us a little about that story? Because I think that two-way trust is really important, and I'm not sure people would understand that.
Yeah, so I deployed to Afghanistan in 2014. I was a lieutenant. On paper, my job was an intelligence liaison officer. But as often happens in the military, you go where you're needed. And it turned out what was most needed was somebody to drive a vehicle. So a lot of my time was spent just on vehicle movements outside the wire, getting people from point A to point B and trying to make sure that happened without incident and safely. Fairly early in my tour, I was in a situation where we were in a traffic jam, which is typical in the Afghan capital of Kabul. And I saw a man approaching our vehicle, and I had been trained in the different threats, and one of them that was pretty typical was for a magnetically placed explosive device to be stuck in the wheel well of a vehicle. Sometimes they'd have a kid run up to your car, stick it there, and run away. And we were passing through an area called Masood Circle. It's a central intersection in Kabul. The Marines had a nickname for it. They called it Suicide Circle because of how many suicide bombings and incidents had happened there. So as soon as this stranger was approaching my vehicle, which was an unusual thing, I had a decision to make. Do I jump out of the vehicle and level my weapon at him, or do I wait and see what it is he's going to do? And trying to gauge his body language and the signals he was sending, I made the determination, without being able to know for sure, that he seemed to be approaching my vehicle with good intent, even though he was reaching toward the wheel well of the car. And my life and the life of the Marines sitting next to me depended on whether we were going to be able to handle this situation right, and in a way whether I thought it was right or wrong to trust him. Getting out of the vehicle is exposing myself and the enlisted person with me to a whole different level of danger, and so there was no great option. But in that split second, decided to trust him. And sure enough, what turned out to be the case was that we'd been in a traffic jam so tight. It's almost like the way your shoulders press up against people when you're going into a concert or a football game, only with cars. And part of his car had got stuck in part of mine, and I hadn't noticed it. And all he wanted to do was reach and get this piece of fiberglass out of the wheel well of my vehicle and stick it back onto his Toyota Corolla. And as soon as he did that, he waved sheepishly and sped off. But there was this moment where he and I were both deciding whether we could trust each other. He was placing his life on my hands by approaching the vehicle without being able to communicate why. And I was making a decision about whether I could trust him with my life by not jumping out of the car and leveling my M4. And part of what I think about, of course, is the nature of those moments that happen, especially in war zones, and even more so for people in special operations or combat roles. But then the other thing I thought about more and more is that you actually don't have to be in a war zone to trust somebody with your life in a traffic situation. In fact, anytime you've ever driven your car through a green light, your life has depended on whether you could trust the person at the red light to obey the traffic rules. And 99.99% of the time, people do. These trust relationships actually underwrite everything we do. It's not possible to drive a car, to buy a sandwich, let alone to run a military operation or to fall in love without the role of trust. And understanding that and exposing that was a big part of what I sought to do in the book.
Good. back in March, prior to COVID happening, you participated in this walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and there were hundreds of marchers who had been bloodied during that time in 1965, and they were beaten. And more recently, what's going on in our world? How do we gain the trust from these disenfranchised or marginalized citizens who feel that they can't trust? How do we go? What are those first steps, do you think?
Well, Black Americans in particular have every reason to be distrustful of American institutions, not just government institutions, but medicine. We're thinking right now about how important it is for Americans to trust, for example, the medical community when a safe and effective vaccine is delivered. But think about what it means for those who are only 1 or 2 generations away from horrors like the Tuskegee medical experiments that are just one example of how every institution in American life, in explicit and implicit ways, has discriminated. And we also have to remember that trust is not distributed equally. In other words, this is not just about asking people to trust institutions, it's about whether institutions trust people. One reason why Black Americans are more vulnerable to police violence is that there's a presumption of dangerousness. Brian Stevenson has called it a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that Americans of color and Black men in particular experience. You can see this quantified in the way that credit markets work, and the fact that credit ratings carry an identifiable racial disparate nature, racial discrepancy there too. And so the reason I reflected a lot on the experience of being on the Edmund Pettus Bridge was to think about what motivated figures like John Lewis, who knew that those who were at the other end of that bridge, state troopers and county sheriffs and deputies waiting with violent intent, not with goodwill. In other words, people who couldn't be trusted, that these marchers still had enough trust in each other and had enough trust in their cause and had enough trust in the possibility of our institutions to change when they were confronted with a demand, that they were able to step forward and risk their lives in order to do it. The other thing that happened was that they created imagery that the American people couldn't ignore. Americans who maybe didn't trust accounts of racial repression in the South had no choice but to trust their own eyes as they watched on television what was happening. And by putting their bodies on the line, these marchers had the courage to change the trust equation in ways that I think directly led to so many achievements in the civil rights era, even though we know much of that work remains unfinished to this day.
Great. So when Peter was a student at Harvard, he was very involved in our survey group. And I talked to John Della Volpe this morning because I told him I was going to be talking to you. And he said it's his past. But in 2002, he looked back and he said, only 3% of the young people, this was only the groups that we were working at, young people, said they never trust the government. Today, the most recent survey said 17% would never trust the federal government. What do you think we can do for younger people and really focus on younger people? I mean, there's some people who have their positions and we're not going to change them, but what can we do for these younger folks who need to see what can we put forward that will help them come along?
Yeah. It's really something to think back to that moment, because I remember when I was a student working on that survey of youth attitudes. And what we saw was after 9/11, there was this spike. There was this upswing in trust in institutions, the government, the military. And then it fell off, and I think it got worse than before because that moment was squandered. Emergencies can either bring us together, or as we're seeing right now, they can actually contribute to us being driven further and further apart. And it's a warning and a lesson. I think for young people, the most important thing is to recognize that this is very much a collective problem or issue. In other words, the government is us. It's only as good as we, or bad as we make it or let it become. And this is one of the reasons why voting is so important. Voting is not the only thing it's going to take to make things better. But I can guarantee that without it, things won't get better. It's not that you have to naively suppose that the system is perfect. Look, we know that things like gerrymandering and the role of money in politics and the exclusion of people who live in DC and Puerto Rico from political representation and so many other things that go on have twisted our system. But our system is also the only thing that can fix itself. In other words, the elegance of the Constitution is it creates ways to self-heal if and only if people get involved. In other words, we need to participate in elections to elect leaders who will make our elections more fair. This is the only, or at least the most powerful tool in our hands. And all of the social media activism and all of the activism in the streets has to be backed up by behavior at the moment of maximum power, which is the moment you fill in that ballot. It's the only moment that you have power over the president of the United States, because you can fire him. These are the moments that give us the tools to actually be able to change these systems that we can all admit are showing their rigidity and have just not been able to meet the moment. It's up to us.
Good. Ronald Reagan famously said the most terrifying words in the English language is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And then Bill Clinton said, "The government of big government is over." So how can we bring people together to realize the government is not the problem, and what can we do to show people that this is something that can be helpful to them as opposed to causing them angst and anxiety?
Yeah, I think one of the unfortunate things that happened in and after the Reagan era is that a philosophical conservative belief that government should be limited kind of morphed into a project of undermining trust in government, period. The really remarkable thing about President Reagan saying that the most frightening words in the English language were, "I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help," is that he said those as a sitting president. In other words, at the time that he said that, he was from the federal government. He was running the federal government. And this went from being a sort of fringe sentiment to so mainstream that soon a Democratic president like Bill Clinton was kind of obliged to say something similar to celebrate the reduction of government. I think beyond the question of big or small, which is a legitimate philosophical debate, and as someone who's more progressive, I know where I stand in that debate. There's a core question about making sure the government is something that can be trusted to do the right thing at its job. And that means making sure that there's the transparency, that there's the institutional strength, that there's the quality of people, and the sense of mission in government to get that done. And sometimes government's not a sexy thing. But again, this is one of those things that doesn't get better if we leave it to the kind of laws of gravity to pull it down. We've got to get in there and pick it up. And what I hope could happen, in a way that maybe we haven't seen since President Kennedy's call to service and what was at stake when he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you," is that this might actually be a moment where a lot of us can get in there and make government more responsive, make government more effective. If the people leading government don't believe in government, it's likely to become a self-fulfilling process. But if people of both parties who are placed in positions of trust to guide and steer and oversee and run our government are committed to making sure it works better, we can actually deliver in new and better ways on everything from healthcare to infrastructure. And the countries that are doing the best right now at dealing with the pandemic are generally high trust societies where people do have that level of trust and it's not considered an ideological or partisan question.
Great. You talked at one point about the idea of maybe creating some kind of a Peace Corps, like maybe a domestic Peace Corps. I think the idea of bringing an AmeriCorps or Peace Corps together to give students and young people the opportunity to get in, work with their colleagues from all different parts of the country and make a difference. What do you think? I mean, is that something that you think is possible?
Absolutely. I love it. And, your senator from Delaware, Chris Coons, is probably the most outspoken and active voice in the Senate on this right now. Look, if you look at the acceptance rates for the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, the military itself, they're on the order of 15 to 25%, which means for every person who gets a chance to serve, there's 4 or 5 who would have if they could. And imagine how much that number would go up if we were actually funding service and compensating service so that it wasn't viewed as just something for people who had no alternative or a kind of luxury project for people who could afford to take a year off, but really something that was universal. I'm not saying we have to make people do it, but I think we could move toward it being a kind of a norm. When you finish high school, you do a year of service, and whether you're going right into a job or a union apprenticeship program or a university, you could expect that the first question you get when you apply is, tell us about your year of service. Who did you meet? What did you do? And what did you learn? That would not only allow us to do some really worthy projects. Imagine what a climate corps could achieve right now, weatherizing homes, for example. Imagine what a community health corps could achieve right now, helping with things like addiction and mental health, and maybe motivating people to have careers in mental health while we're at it. So the work is waiting to be done. But it's not just that, it's the practice of doing the work. That's what I took away from the military, learning to trust my life to people I barely knew, who had very different backgrounds, racial or regional or political, definitely different politics, and learning to trust them with my life. And you don't have to be at war for that to happen, but it does happen when you're put together with a diverse group, given something hard to do, depending on each other to meet that mission. And it's why I'm a big believer in the potential of service to help make that possible.
We're all big supporters of Chris Coon's idea, because I think it's something that really would make a difference for young people, and to know that's something you could go into and make a difference. Because even back then, when we did our surveys of young people 20 years ago, they wanted to do something. They cared. They felt they could do more through community service than they could do through politics. But hopefully we can find a way to give them an opportunity, and it could be a great thing for this country. Another thing you talked about completely separate is this false equivalency discussion, which I think is really interesting. The fact when you have what's the media's role in this? It's sort of like, it's this or this, and nobody gives the facts or the figures. And I feel like it's a really frustrating thing for a lot of people, not only young people, but people who think, I just want to know the truth and I can't seem to get it. And they give you these two options and you never get to the truth. Tell us a little about your thought on false equivalency.
Yeah, I wrote a section of the book about the media because I think this is hugely important. And I think all of us are aware of the role that opinion media has played. But there's also an issue with, actually, ironically, with media trying to be even-handed. And the problem arises when you feel obliged to do a one hand, other hand presentation, even when one hand has been thoroughly discredited. It creates the impression that there are two equally valid positions on every debate. And it creates the impression that there are only two perspectives when there might be multiple perspectives that deserve to be heard. And so having a diversity of opinion is a great idea and is very important. But we saw this a lot, particularly on climate, as the consensus on climate science came to be a 99% thing in the scientific community. It was still presented as a 50-50 sort of thing in the media. And out of this desire to be even-handed came actually a distortion, because it wasn't 50-50. Almost always the so-called climate skeptic who was invited to sit across from the climate scientist was somebody who was funded or in some way backed by an interest group that had an interest in delaying or defeating the increasing consensus of science. And that's incredibly costly and incredibly dangerous. I think we've seen some of that now, normalizing things that go on in the Trump administration that are not about being fair to a Republican perspective, because Republicans ought to be as horrified as Democrats by some of the stuff that's gone on. Now, the good news is there seems to be a reaction to that now. I mean, you're seeing a lot of Republicans saying, look, this isn't the party that I signed up for. And there's a chance, I think, to maybe recenter this. But I think media have an obligation to not always pick a side, but think about what they're presenting and what it means to be fair. I'll give you one more example that I think is really interesting and important. Everyone knows about Russian troll activity in the 2016 election to harm the Clinton campaign. But one of the lesser known studies that I write about in the book is about what Russia did around the subject of vaccines, starting from 2014 to 2017. So this is before, during, and after the 2016 election. A public health journal did a massive study of all of the tweets from all of the accounts that were known to be Russia connected on the subject of vaccination. It's very interesting what they did. They pushed out anti-vaccine misinformation and pro-vaccine information, sometimes out of the same accounts. And what that demonstrates is that they were interested in creating an atmosphere of doubt around something that was an object of settled science, not just by pushing one perspective, but just by stirring the pot, because creating that kind of doubt and that kind of controversy was an end in itself. And that's one example of how this kind of both sidism can actually be actively harmful. Is that we know Russia used both sidism as part of a direct and intentional effort to undermine trust in institutions in the U.S.
Good. Now you talk about Joe Trippi, who, for those of you who don't know, Joe is he's a Democratic political operative who was very involved when the internet, engaging in the internet with Howard Dean's campaign. And he said, it's the most democratizing invention we've ever seen, more so than the printing press, as you say. But for all its faults, to how do the internet and social media may be able to transform? There's good and bad of this. So what's the good part of it? I mean, we obviously know the bad in some ways, but what are the ways you can see the internet and social media being used for good, not to just break us apart?
Yeah, so I remember being a student during those years and seeing it up close when we'd go up to New Hampshire as Joe Trippi and Howard Dean really made magic with these new tools, things that sound very quaint now, like Meetup, if you remember that. MySpace was just getting to be a thing. It took another campaign cycle before people figured out how Facebook could become a political organizing tool, although Barack Obama did that pretty effectively. What's interesting is that there was a lot of hope around what technology could do in the 90s and 2000s to democratize our politics. And what we see now is that it's cut both ways, to put it charitably. In many ways, it's created such an overload of information and misinformation that it's actually become harder to have a democratic experience in online spaces. I think we're still probably decades away from being able to say conclusively what the arrival of these forms of media mean for our politics. But we can see a couple of things now that matter from the perspective of trust. One of them is the importance of journalism, and in particular, the importance of the editorial function. So there was a period where it felt like technology was going to make reporters almost unnecessary because people would just go out with cell phones. Before you could get a reporter to a difficult space, somebody would have already captured the news-making event on cell phone video. And we see that all the time as images recorded just out of somebody's pocket wind up on television instead of something that a professional reporter and photographer captured. On the other hand, the more of that comes in, the more we actually need journalists to help us sort through it. In the same way that in the intelligence community, we talk about the difference between raw information and actual intelligence, which is where you've made judgments and recommendations and conclusions about that raw information. That's something we need right now more than ever. And so journalism is not going to be replaced by technology. Its role is going to be, if anything, enhanced. And yet technology has also reduced things like the amount of revenue going into newspapers. I'll tell you, as mayor of South Bend, I had my dust-ups with the local paper because I'd get mad at them if I didn't think their coverage was fair, but I always knew that they cared about making sure it was fair. And we would be so much worse off as a community if we didn't have journalists. I mean, sometimes I'd learn things about the community that as mayor I didn't know. Sometimes I'd learn things going on in my own administration or council that would not have been brought to light if it weren't for the work of journalists. And it can put an elected leader in an awkward position, but that's kind of the point. And so we need to think about ways to reward good journalism that replace the old revenue models, or we're going to continue losing newspapers at an alarming rate.
Well, let's talk a little about social media companies and what responsibility do you believe they have in this day of misinformation and disinformation? What can they do on their platforms, and especially young people? I think young people are more aware of what isn't real information than others, but how do we get through this transition period?
Yeah, I think you're right that part of it is this kind of transition phenomenon of kind of maturing into it. So in the same way that, if you and I are flipping through the New York Times or Newsweek, sometimes we'll hit a full page ad that's made to look a little bit like the news.
Right.
And we've got that pattern recognition in our brains, right? That in about half a second, your eye falls on the text and you're like, oh, this is an ad. Mm-hmm. We don't have quite that same built-in pattern recognition, I think, for the digital media that are coming our way. And I think if you grow up on it, you'll have a little more of a sensor for that. And I'm in that kind of on the bubble, right? Because I'm in that elder millennial kind of layer that when I got to the Institute of Politics, Facebook and YouTube didn't exist. And by the time I graduated, they did. So we were right on the bubble. What I think also is really going to be important, though, to your question, is for these companies to step up and take responsibility. They want to be treated like a utility sometimes, saying, look, like, hey, we're just the pipes. All this stuff is just flowing through our pipes. We don't want to get into the business of saying what's true and what's false. But at the same time, they don't want to be regulated like utilities are. And so at a certain point, they can't have it both ways. And the reality is they make money not just from the amount of stuff that flows through, for example, the number of tweets that happen or the amount of clicks that go on Facebook. They also make more money when there's more controversy, because that's part of how our brains and our eyeballs are sucked in. They do bear responsibility for that in ways that I think many people are taking more seriously than before. I think there's some soul searching, but I'm not sure the soul searching is happening fast enough out there in Silicon Valley. And I think in the end, as long as companies, every time they make a corporate decision, are really making a public policy decision, as long as that goes on, we're going to be in a world where it's the failure of regulation to create some left and right boundaries here. That puts them in that position and makes them too powerful. Now, there's all kinds of problems around how we do it. We're committed to freedom of speech, and we can't let that go. But there's got to be more responsibility for companies that make preposterous amounts of money off of our attention.
Right. I watched Social Dilemma this weekend, and you've seen that, yeah. And it makes you think really hard about what's going on out there. So now, before we're going to move on to some student questions, which you'll appreciate more than my questions, but you talked about creating a government that's trustworthy, and we have all these young people. What's your recommendation for them to get involved, and what can they do as students and young people, in addition to voting? What can they do to make this better? Because I think there's a lot of students who want to, but don't know what the next steps are.
Yeah. Well, in addition to voting and volunteering and being engaged that way, and I hope everyone, look, the longer you're planning to be here, the more you have at stake in this election, some irreversible decisions that are about to be made. But there's a lot more to it, of course, than just political involvement or just voting. And the biggest thing that I would, and this is me revealing maybe where you stand is based on where you sit, but don't overlook the value of the local. Again, I was at the Institute of Politics filling my head with stories of international relations and national politics, but it was really when I got involved locally that I found a whole new level of meaning and a different way of building trust. I came to learn who I could rely on, and it wasn't always people in my own party, although often it was. I learned how to build the relationships that made it possible to get stuff done, whether it was pushing a budget through or instituting some kind of reform or just bringing people in the community together around a tough issue. And any of the toughest issues you're hearing about nationally get cashed out on a local level. Certainly that's true with racial justice and police violence. And our community struggled with that like every community in America. But also issues of economic justice, housing, even climate. The most global issue you can think of ultimately comes down to what happens in specific places on choices around how buildings are built and how vehicles move around and how our economies are developed. And so there's a chance. The other great thing if you're young is, in order to testify in Congress, you have to actually be invited. In order to speak out in a local decision-making process, you just show up. I've seen votes go differently because of the testimony of high school students not even old enough to vote, who compelled elected officials to think a little bit differently. The other thing I would urge young people to do, and you see this in the movement for Black Lives, you see this in the March for Our Lives, you see this in climate activism. I mean, the most famous global climate activist is a Swedish teenager who wouldn't be old enough to vote if she were a US citizen. One of the most powerful things in the world is a young person looking in the eyes of somebody in a position of responsibility and saying, what are you doing to keep me safe? And that moral power is something that I think is being unlocked in new ways by a generation of activists who have the potential to change everything in this country. And it can't come a moment sooner.
Good. So Peter, before we move to the student questions, you had to tell us one funny story from your campaign trail. I didn't give you this to think about, but I'm sure you have a million great stories. But do you have a great, I know I've done campaigns for years, and there's always some moment that you think, how did this ever happen? You must have a good story from your campaign.
Oh yeah, gosh, I mean, how do I even pick? There are so many little like Veep moments, especially because remember how many remember how many candidates there were, right? Just the sheer number of candidates. And so as our campaigns got more sophisticated and we started having the same advanced protocols on the ground, there were also a lot of black SUVs. More than once, I was almost in the vehicle of one of my competitors coming out from a debate or something like that. The funny thing is, it actually happened last night in Utah. I'm glad nobody was hurt, because I thought I saw a black SUV pull up. I thought it was my ride out from the debate site, and had my handle on the door when I happened to glance at the window and saw 4 like very serious special forces looking kind of dudes who were, whatever they were doing, they were not my ride off the debate site. There were moments all the time, and then there were the spontaneous moments, the protests, some of which were, very serious-minded protest actions around different campaign appearances, including mine. But I remember I was getting ready to go on stage in Iowa, and advanced staffer came up to me at the last minute and said, "Mayor, just so you know, there's a cow. There's someone in a cow suit." And it's like, okay. And I was like, do we happen to know if it's a right-wing cow or a left-wing cow? Like, no, we're not sure.
We're not sure of the status.
Always going on in the background.
There's always a moment. Anyways, well, we're going to move to our student questions now. I think Perry's going to bring them up on the screen for us. So we have some students from our group. So let me see. I know. Oh, here's Nick. They're coming on. And we'll start with, so these students, we just formed the Student Advisory Committee, Peter, so you'll be happy to know.
Wonderful.
And so the first student, Isha, is Isha up yet? I can't see.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, there you are, Isha. Isha's a world scholar and a member of the UD Community Engagement Initiative, and she had a question for you.
Great.
Yeah. Hi, Mayor Pete. I'm Isha. I'm a public policy and communications double major in my sophomore year. And I just want to start off by thanking you for being a voice for younger people and just taking the time to talk to us today. So my question is two-parted. Despite facing all the polarization in our country and the comments about being called too young and all of that, right? How have you been able to continue to focus your passion on policy work and make positive change? And how do you recommend the rest of us work to find common ground between all of these varying perspectives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it starts just with the idea of encounter. Like, we got to get across these information silos and bubbles. By the way, probably the greatest thing that humanity has invented for the purpose of doing this, other than the city, is the university. So you're in the middle of it. You're in the middle of one of the best chances to engage with people who come at the world differently than you do. That, unfortunately, it can get harder to do that after you leave the university environment, unless you're actively trying to create that through joining communities that are overlapping. One of the things I write about in the book is, when you belong to a group or a circle of belonging, that group has a lot of trust. But there's an insider outsider problem. That trust for those inside the group depends on a distinction between those inside and those on the outside. Now, as long as our circles of belonging overlap, right? Maybe I belong to a college Democrats club, but I'm also on a soccer team that's Democrats and Republicans. And not everybody plays soccer, but among those who do, it turns out there are a few who belong to my church, and there are people in my church who have different generations. But through some intergenerational effort I'm part of, I get to know people who belong to an Islamic center that's a different community faith. Right? The more those circles overlap, the better. One of the problems is our circles are getting concentric. The fact that I'm a college graduate, progressive, gay, live in a city, might tell you most of what you would need to know to predict how I'm going to vote. The more that those circles are kind of grouped that way, the more trouble we're in. So we got to find patterns of belonging, ways to interact with each other that don't hinge on things that are connected to politics. It's one of the reasons, again, that I think service is such a great idea. The other thing is just to go literally seek out places where people are going to disagree with us. I started my day on Fox and Friends. I was doing it carrying the banner from my perspective, but also believing that there are people tuning in good faith who maybe still aren't going to agree with me after watching me on TV for 4 or 6 minutes, but at least I won't. At least I'll know they've heard the perspective that they might not have if I didn't go out there and offer it to them. So it's that process of encounter more than anything else that creates a sense of knowledge, that can create a sense of trust, that can let us hash out our disagreements. And as long as our disagreements are about the different interests that we represent or the different values we hold, we can do it in good faith. But it only works if all of that tug of war plays out while we're standing on the same field of fact. And inhabiting the same reality only happens if we have some measure of shared experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that response.
Thanks.
Sorry, I turned my volume off. That was me. Famita Zaman is next.
Hi, Mayor Pete. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you talking to us. I'm Famida. I'm an international student at UD in political science. My question is, how has your experience in Afghanistan shaped your view about the United States' global leadership role? And can this role be revitalized after all the changes that happened over the past 4 years?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And you know, my experience in Afghanistan really shaped me in many ways. It's an extraordinary, hauntingly beautiful country. It's a country whose experience of pluralism is more diverse, perhaps even than that of the United States, and we have a lot to learn from how that's negotiated. And of course, my experience was as part of a multinational coalition, and so every day I got up and was surrounded by North Macedonian guards and British law enforcement personnel, and there was a Danish general, and there were Italian MPs on the base, and we all depended on each other, including countries that, you know, I thought I was on my way to a July 4th picnic. I think I mentioned this in the book, and a German general crossed my path, and we exchanged salutes, and then I thought about what it meant that my grandfather served in the US military fighting against Germany, and now we were part of this coalition. But of course, also on the ground, we were working with Afghan partners. My particular mission had to do with financing that was going into terrorism, and so we worked with financial regulators in addition to law enforcement on the Afghan side. And what you learned was the importance of being reliable and predictable. Now, predictability is not fashionable. It's usually considered boring to be predictable. But if you think about trust, trust happens when we know what to expect from one another. And part of how I felt the flag on my shoulder served to protect me, it made it easier to do my job, was the sense that the flag represented a country that could be relied on. It's why it's been so distressing, I think, for us, those of us who served in the military, to see how the US has been made unpredictable and unreliable by the president, and why I think restoring the credibility of the US is going to be the top international job of the next president, and it needs to be done very swiftly. But it's an example of a place whose problems are not easy to solve, and no one can swoop in and solve them. It's an example of a place whose future depends on cooperation, and in that sense, it represents the entire world, because all of our futures depend on cooperation.
Good. Our next question is Allison Lawson. Allison is a graduate nursing student and an Army National Guard member who also served in Afghanistan. She has a question for you.
Yes.
Mayor Pete, thank you for your service to start with. And my question for you is, as a former service member, do you feel that the recent transgender military ban precedes future military changes to LGBTQ people serving openly in the military? Could a don't ask, don't tell type policy return?
Well, first of all, thank you for serving. And, I'm really worried about, you remember when unit cohesion was used as an excuse to delay allowing people to serve openly? The thought went, which proved not to be true, but the thought went that, it would be harder for units to trust each other if there were LGBT members serving openly. And not only was that not true, the reverse was true, actually. It put a lot of pressure on trust and cohesion for people to have to conceal who they were. I think we're seeing that now with the transgender military ban that tells some people their service isn't good enough. And the great thing about the military is that it's an opportunity to render service to this country and to be evaluated based on what you have to offer, without regard to any patterns of privilege or exclusion that you have in civilian life. At least in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. I do think that we have an opportunity to enact a federal equality act that will do away with discrimination, civilian and military. It's one of the reasons why it's important for it to happen. I'm very concerned about the talk of backsliding on the Supreme Court, as revealed in the recent letter of Justices Thomas and Alito that seemed determined to put marriage equality back on the table, something I thought that we had settled in this country a few years ago. And it's really important for the security and the integrity of our country and our military that people be allowed to bring their whole selves to service, just as I think that's better for public service on the civilian side. And it's one of many reasons why we must not regard the work of equality for the LGBTQ plus community as being complete. And the military famously was a step ahead of much of the U.S. when it came to racial integration. The military was integrated before much of the country was, and I think helped pull the country along. We have, I think, in some ways seen that as well with the experience for our community, but there's a long way to go.
Good, thanks, Pete. The last question is from John Cohill. John is the student government vice president for the University of Delaware. So maybe he has a future running for office somewhere. And John has a question for you.
Thank you, Mary Pete, for being with us on behalf of the University of Delaware community. Thank you for just talking with us and being with us today. And thank you for your service, both in the military and public office. My question for you is, so what's next? After your book tour, after the election, what are your future aspirations?
I don't know. One thing, and that's not being cagey, it's just an honest answer. I know what I want to do. I know that I want to have an impact in helping the United States to cohere, helping to create a culture of belonging in the U.S., and helping the U.S. to restore its leadership position in the world on concrete issues like climate and moral issues like democracy. But how to do that? So much depends on how things develop. And one thing that would never have been on my mind when I was a student would be to say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go home, I'm going to run statewide, I'm going to get clobbered, then I'll run for mayor, and then in my 8th year of mayor, I'll go straight into seeking the presidency, right? Like, this is not a path that would have made sense if I tried to game it out. And I think maybe a little too much, it's good to have a plan, but a little too much energy sometimes for talented, ambitious young people goes into figuring out the moves. I think it's much more fruitful to think about what you most care about working on, the issues, the ideas that you most care about, and then look for the best opportunity in front of you to do something about it. And that will lead you, because that'll create its own propulsion, that'll lead you to opportunities to excel and to make more and more of a difference, sometimes along a path you never would have seen coming. And that's the best part of it. So what I know is that we've got about 3.5 weeks to make sure that there is, in fact, a Biden-Harris administration. And I'm doing everything that I can, from stumping in local TV markets by Zoom to spending about 3 weeks learning to inhabit the mind of Mike Pence to help with debate prep, whatever I could do to help the cause. Anything I think about what happens after that is pretty much academic, unless we make that happen. I would love to return to public service, and I imagine in one way or another, sooner or later in life, I'll get that chance. But what I know in the meantime is I've got to make sure there's a Biden-Harris administration, and then once there is, do everything I can to support that administration, whether it's from the inside or from the outside.
Well, Peter, we really appreciate you. I know you're in the middle of a book tour, and we appreciate being a first stop on your store, or one of your first stops. And again, I remind people, if you want to get a copy of the book, it's mayorpetebook.com, so you can get on. But thank you for being here, and we'll see you again in 20 years, and we'll see what we do next. Actually, Peter and I see each other at various events along the way, so it's been great to kind of keep up, and I really appreciate it. And there's a few IOP people on today watching, so I saw Ann Aaron and Rob McCarthy and a few others, so they're all keeping an eye on you as well. So,
well, thank you, Catherine, for guiding the conversation, and to the students and everybody for such great questions. And thanks everybody for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Peter.
Take care.
Bye-bye.